Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dream Collective Executive Discussion today. We've got a fantastic conversation. Me and the panelists were actually already starting the conversation before we started broadcasting this, and I know for sure that we've got a lot of really interesting insights prepared in store for you. So thank you for everyone who's tuning in today. My name is Sarah Liu. I'm the Managing Director for the Dream Collective. We are a global diversity and inclusion consulting firm, and basically to know what we do and sort of who we are really is we help businesses solve three problems, and that's either attraction of female talent, retention, or advancement of female talent. And whilst we absolutely recognize that there are different types of diversity, our focus is very much around, and our specialty is around the gender diversity element and female advancement. We know that through research that if we can support and enable equality for the 50% of the population, all the other diverse group will also benefit as well. So that's very much our zone of genius and our focus for the time being. And so as a market leader working with a lot of incredible companies around the globe, but specifically around APAC as well, to help them drive the diversity and inclusion agenda, we know that in order to actually create real and meaningful change, sometimes we need to have the challenging conversations, the tough questions that nobody wants to ask. And that's actually precisely the intent and the sentiment behind these our webinar series, because it's actually about opening up conversations and sometimes inviting disagreement even, so that we can meaningfully bridge the gaps in any understanding and meaningfully move forward. So I know that when people first see our discussion topic today is 50-50 come at the expense of men, I think that sends a little bit of shiver down people's spine, I think sometimes, and creates a little bit of sensitivity. But that's precisely, I think, what's important for us to actually, in Ofer's word, to actually take the sting out of that statement a little bit and actually bridge any understanding and bridge any disconnect or discomfort there may be. Because the spirit about inclusion really is about bringing everybody along on the journey. And that's what we intend on doing today. It's not necessarily prescribing if you need to have gender targets, etc., because we recognize that context, is different for every company. So, it can be different for people. And we also recognize that, gender is not binary either, right? So we appreciate that we're taking a more of a simplistic approach, but the intent is to start the conversation somewhere, and hopefully it will open up doors to greater opportunities. So with that, I want to actually introduce our two very special panelists today. And I must tell you that not only have I actually personally shared, various panels with both of them, and know that they are not only engaging and captivating speakers, but also great and genuine allies in this space. But what really excited me was that when we announced that we've got John and Ofer sitting on the panel, I actually had the team from Google, a couple of women actually emailing me and saying, oh my God, I'm so excited you've got John on board because he is such a great ally. They don't know that I'm telling them this, but I was like, yeah, fantastic. Yes, he's joining. And what's really interesting is that yesterday, we were having conversations with the ANZ team in Japan. And one of the women actually told us that, hey, I saw that you're having Ofer as a speaker. I used to work very closely with him. Can I just tell you that he's awesome? And I'm so glad that you've got him on the panel. So I think that's great and real testament to both of you for your leadership and just genuine, I think, sort of allyship and sponsorship for driving equity in this space. So I'm so thrilled to be sort of starting the conversation with both of you today. We'll let them introduce themselves a little bit as we sort of go into the conversation. But as we dive in, I want to share with you a little bit of a context around why 50-50. So when COVID sort of happened and started really influencing and affecting the world as we know it, as a team here at the Dream Collective, we really wanted to uncover what kind of companies can lead effectively through this crisis? What companies that do really well during this time have in common? So we collaborated with a global insights agency called Dynata, conducted a nationwide research of over 2,000 respondents across 5 cities in Australia to uncover precisely what characteristics of a leadership team, can successfully lead the business out of a crisis. And guess what? To our surprise, actually, the one consistent factor and the element that influenced how companies performed during the COVID-19 crisis was actually whether they had 50-50 gender equal leadership team or not. So what we found was that companies that were able to adapt, innovate, and achieve the highest employee engagement during this crisis time had one thing in common, and that was a 50-50 gender equal leadership team. So I'll take you through some high-level key insights, but the full research is actually available on our dreamcollective.com.au website. So I invite you to actually download, go through it, even with your team, circulate that internally, and start the conversation. The first thing we uncovered in the research is that teams and companies led by 50-50 gender equal leadership team have the highest ability to adapt and pivot at 46%. And that was consistently higher than led by majority female leadership team at 44% and 39%, which are companies led by majority male leadership team. And then the second pillar was that once again, companies led by 50-50 leadership team had the highest ability to innovate new products and services during this time. And that was actually one of the biggest variance. So we had 32% compared to 27% for majority female and 20% for majority male leadership teams. And that 12% was actually the highest variance. So that's really interesting when we talk about how diversity has a direct impact to innovation. The third key insight we uncovered was that employee well-being and engagement were also the highest in companies led by 50-50 gender equal leadership team at 65% compared to 56% at majority female leadership team and 54% majority male leadership team. Some other insight that we've also uncovered was that those who worked at companies with 50-50 leadership team companies were least likely to consider leaving during the crisis, which I thought is very interesting because that speaks directly to retention during this time. And then the next one as well, you will see that for companies led by gender balanced leadership team directly translate to a more gender balanced workforce as well. So how gender balanced your workforce is a direct reflection of the makeup and the DNA of your leadership team. And so with that as well, we wanted to look at what is the impact of having male and female leaders, the CEOs, versus leadership team. And what we uncovered was that male and female CEOs were rated fairly similarly in all areas, with one exception, which is the area of innovation. And company led by female CEOs were shown to outperform those by male CEOs by 8%. But what's really more interesting is that the gender split of leadership team actually had a more direct impact on a company's performance compared to the gender of a CEO. I think that's also really interesting because it's not just looking at, one or two people leading the way. It's actually recognizing the impact your leadership team and the gender and diversity in there, how that can directly translate to your business performance. So there's a lot of fascinating insights in the research report. So I really encourage you to download it and have a read and start the conversation. So with that, I'd love to probably launch right into the conversation. John and Ofer, did the research findings sort of surprise you, or it came as completely expected?
I can just make a couple of quick comments to that. Firstly, I think it was incredible to actually conduct some research in this once in a lifetime moment where we could actually look at things and calibrate things that otherwise we couldn't actually do. So firstly, that was actually pretty impressive. The thing that jumped out to me though more than anything else is that the disparity between a male dominated leadership team and where we had closer to 50-50. The disparity was really huge in regards of the impact on the organization. And the one that stood out to me the most, I wrote it down, there was an 18-point difference between 50-50 and male, and that was, and I'll read this out and everyone will nod and say completely, I find my company's communication during these times is sincere and honest. And when it was male dominated, it was 18 points lower than when it was actually 50-50. And so for me, it sort of like really resonated that these are the things that need to be brought to life. The pandemic research really highlights it, but it's symptomatic of what life is like every day. We need to see how do we move the needle from one to the other.
Excellent. Ofer?
Sarah, I also didn't find anything surprising there. Firstly, it was really well presented and it's an important research document, and I'm very excited to share it with my colleagues across ANZ. So well done for actually doing that research. One of the things that it highlighted for me was I used to, when I was in agency land, I didn't quite understand the impact that a leader can have on a large organization. And then I joined various large corporates, and then I was fixated on this idea that it's all about the CEO. And over time, what I grew to realize is that sometimes you can have the most phenomenal individual who's the CEO, who has all the right characteristics and behaviors, but they aren't the ones who have the direct day-to-day impact on what happens in the organization. And it really is that CEO's leadership team that has so much control and influence on the culture and how the organization behaves. And so I've seen CEOs who were phenomenal, but couldn't quite put in place that next level of leadership that mimicked a lot of their kind of aspirations and values. And then I've seen CEOs, and I have to say, and a little plug for ANZ, but certainly in our organization, I think there is such a strong alignment between our CEO and our executive team. And so what this reinforced, actually, what's phenomenal about this is just reinforcing that executive team and more emphasis on the executive team rather than specifically emphasis on the CEO is really important. So that was a big validation for me.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think, more and more so we are focusing on, the impact of that executive team rather than, the specific CEOs, and which is really fascinating. And I think, for both of you, you guys sit at that executive level. And I think what's really interesting for us is that neither of you actually is in that HR sort of space. And we were quite intentional in engaging leaders who are business unit leaders to actually join this conversation and bring a fresh perspective in. So I'd probably love for you to actually share with the audience today a little bit as well. Like, what's your personal connection to the topic, and what do you really want to probably share with them today?
I'm happy to share. Look, a couple of things, and I just in preparation thinking about it. Look, my strongest connection to the topic is I grew up in a family. I have 3 sisters. I have 2 daughters, an incredible mother. And so from the onset, I guess my perspective on life is that everyone's equal. Everyone should be treated the same. And there should be fantastic opportunities that are all merit-based. And so coming out and then sort of moving into this, that was my mindset. Having been working in this industry now for about 35 years, I've seen a range of different adaptations of good and bad and different things. But I guess my role today and focus is that in the Australian New Zealand Google team, I work on the DEI initiatives, and I run the people initiatives for my part of the business for Asia Pacific. And a big part of that is how we really think about being inclusive, how we make sure that people can bring their complete self to work, and that manifests itself in many ways. And part of that, of course, is making sure that we have gender equity at the leadership level as well. And certainly as the unit that I run, I make sure that we do have a nice balance between genders, and it makes such an incredible difference as well.
And Sarah, I lead design across ANZ. I've spent, I guess, all of my working life focusing on innovation, challenging the status quo, creating new products and services. And I've grown up in an environment which has proven time and time again that you can't create something new and different and better for people unless you've got diversity on your team. And that's diversity in all of its forms. So the moment you limit diversity, you're actually constraining the team's ability to create something that is truly groundbreaking. And so even if you look just at that level, and you look at kind of trying to push the dial on whatever type of business you have or whatever type of non-profit organization you're involved in, if you want to challenge the status quo, you need to have as many different perspectives as possible, which means you actually have to stop trying to limit certain groups or certain individuals to participate. Interestingly, I have also a personal, when I reflect on my own circumstances, my wife is a lawyer, and she's here, and she always gives me dirty looks, but we're both obviously at home. My wife is a lawyer. But of late, we've actually settled into what I would describe as a 1950s relationship. We had 2 kids, and my wife chose to focus on rearing the kids at the expense of her career. And we're now at a point, our kids are a little older, and she's starting to look at returning to the workforce. And it's incredibly difficult for her on a personal level, and also just in terms of a massive gap in her resume. I have benefited tremendously from that, right? And we've always agreed that, we're actually a great partnership, and neither of us are really almost effective on our own. But when I reflect, I've had a very easy run as a male, and it's taken me an incredibly long time to recognize that any woman who has is in a similar level to me has had to crawl over broken glass just to be at the same point that I am, right? And unfortunately, it has taken me way too long to get to this point. And so I think there's just a personal, all of a sudden, I feel like I've got much more, at least appreciation, or I would say starting to get an appreciation for some of the things that are, I think many women who are professionals have become so effective at masking just how much juggling they need to do and how much shit they need to deal with just to get to the same level, right? And so I think what I'm fast realizing is now in my role as a leader, I have an opportunity to maybe make that a little bit more transparent and find ways to compensate for that. But I have to say, it's very difficult to know what to do, given that it's such a systemic problem.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that probably links into my question around, I think right now, everybody, when it comes to inclusion as well, we're trying to create a level playing field for everyone. But, what would you say to some people who feel this is a zero-sum game, that in order to actually advance, diverse groups now, that means, men will be at the expense of that? How do you respond to that? I mean, I think firstly, have you heard, such things being circulated in your experience? There's a what about me sentiment, and how do you respond to that as a leader?
Do you want to go first on this one, Oprah, or do you want me to jump in?
No worries. We're both obscenely polite, so I'll jump in first on this one. So yeah, Sarah, you might actually have to maybe point to us so that we don't just look at each other sheepishly. I think it's the wrong question, the 50-50. I don't feel like I've come across it myself. And again, maybe it's because, frankly, I've just been a little naive. The only time where I've also reflected on, in all the various companies that I've worked, they either now are led by women or have been led by women. And they range from General Motors, who's currently led by Mary Barra, through to IDEO, and recently Sandy Spiker has taken over IDEO in Silicon Valley, through to Westpac with Gail Kelly. And many of my bosses have actually been women, including currently with Miley Carnegie, who used to run Google. And so I think the question, the 50-50, is flawed, because that suggests that it is a zero-sum game. And what we've just spoken about here is that, and if you look at your report, if you have gender kind of equality, right, in gender in all its forms, that the organization is more likely to succeed and more likely to grow. And so as I was reading with this, the moment you say 50-50, it suggests a limited scope, right? And I wonder whether you almost reframe it and say, maybe it should be 50-60, right? To imply that right now, 50% isn't good enough, because we actually, generally, you need a stretch target to get people to get out of bed, right? The closer they get to 50, the more they get complacent. But just to suggest that it is not 100%, it's not a zero-sum game. And so I personally haven't been exposed to it, but again, maybe it's just because I can be a little naive at times.
I love your design thinking on this one. John, what's your take?
It's somewhat similar, and similar to Oprah. I've not been overly exposed to males saying, hey, all this empowerment of women is going to destroy my career. But very much my take is that the results of the survey say that if we have a balanced gender leadership team, we're going to be much more successful. And without those results, certainly that was a personal belief in what we've actually seen happen. And as we actually balance that, it's almost like, how can you not afford to do that? Because your business will be far more successful if you're actually representing in your leadership team what the population's like here and across the planet. So, I mean, how can you afford not to do it? And it's like for Oprah, my manager who runs Asia Pacific, female, absolutely fantastic leader, and my global leader, the president of the business, also female as well. And so across the business and across Google, it's very much a meritocracy, and it's not like, well, you've got to get to this cap or that cap, but very much how we drive and how we see and how we actually make sure these are met. One is definitely we want to have that balance, but also we want to make sure that people with incredible abilities and skills are actually coming forward as well. And the amazing part is there absolutely is incredible talent on both sides. There is one last comment that I think that it's much bigger than us as leaders to fix, which is there's some systemic issues that need to be fixed. And I think about when I was at UTS doing applied science, we maybe had 10 females in the entire year. And I think there's some issues that need to be, how do we really work on our school systems? How do we make sure that the incredible talent there is being nurtured in its earliest stage that's going to come all the way through? Because when it comes to, we want to make sure the senior leaders are balanced 50-50, it needs to be 50-50 all the way through. And so that we don't think about this as the last piece of the journey and think, oh, okay, we need to balance. It needs to be something that it's from the inception, everything needs to be thought about in parity. And I think there's still lots for us to do right across the spectrum and how we make sure that that is the case.
So I think, is that correct to sort of summarize and say that if we hear people say that, suggesting it's a zero-sum game, the best response is to actually remove them from that and see that as a more than 100%, right? Like we're growing the pie. Yes? Fantastic. And so we've actually got a lot of questions coming through already. I love the enthusiasm of the audiences. So we're gonna sort of dive into that as well. And so for everyone who's tuning in, you will have be able to have an opportunity to ask questions directly in the Q&A functions here. So audience has asked, outside of quotas, what diversity, equity, and inclusion tactics have you found to be most successful at the executive and senior leadership or even board level? So outside quotas, what else can we do that can be effective? Who would like to take that first?
Well, I can jump in quickly. I think the first thing is it needs to be part of an ongoing narrative. It needs to be part of a leadership meeting. It needs to be on the agenda all the time. It can't be something that you look at once a year and think, okay, where am I at? Where are those stats? It just doesn't work. There needs to be, certainly from my perspective, someone who in your leadership team sort of carries that as a responsibility, but actually brings and challenges everything we do in regards to DE&I. How are we thinking about this? As we think about our hiring pipelines, are we thinking about it from a DE&I lens? As we think about building our leadership capabilities, are we thinking about it from a DE&I lens? And so for me, quotas is one thing. I care about quotas, but I don't care about quotas. What I care about, we institutionalize these behaviors in everything we do. And so then it becomes a part of, it gets hardwired in everybody's brain that this is a top priority.
Yep, I totally echo that. I think when I'm just reflecting on what I've heard from conversations in leadership meetings, just literally in the last week. We had our extended leadership team meeting of the last 2 days here at ANZ, and our CEO, Shane Elliott, in the opening, before he even conducted any of the other kind of housekeeping, drew our attention to a program on Friday that's focused on diversity and inclusion. That was his opening remark, right? And then we moved on to the daily affairs. He had a meeting earlier in the week where one of my colleagues is in the process of hiring for a very senior role, and she was talking about the challenges of not finding enough female candidates, but that the focus is on making sure that there is a sufficiently wide pipeline of candidates that are diverse before she even gets to the point of kind of whittling down. And so there are a lot of just little signals like that I think are, you need the quotas just so you can have something to measure again, but it's everything else where it's just these little elements are just peppered throughout the conversation.
And for you as well, what have you personally seen as the biggest challenge and barriers to promoting diverse talent into senior leadership? Ofer, do you want to take that one first?
Thank you. Look, interestingly, one could argue that in the design sphere, we might be a little bit more gender balanced, but probably still not quite. And so one of the biggest challenges is actually when I think about when we're looking for more senior folks, in order for them to have the kind of requisite experience, they need to have been in the marketplace for quite a while, having had many, just to have the kind of portfolio that we need across the range of types of services and problems that we're looking at. And it becomes increasingly difficult to find the breadth of experience. And when I reflect, I come back to my earlier point, it's because oftentimes that requires, especially in kind of very extreme design projects, that requires very high availability. A lot of projects are always on the go. And so there are big chunks where women are to some extent often the primary carers, in most cases the primary carers, unfortunately. And it means that when you look at candidates side by side, often the men have just kind of had a free pass and just have broader portfolios. So for me, one of the challenges is really ensuring that we can actually get a lot more people to have the kind of experiences across various levels, so that there is actually more depth of experience to kind of move into these roles. So we're having to do that internally and make sure that we give people opportunities and find ways to support people who might be working part-time, etc., so that it isn't such a big deal. But that definitely, the availability of talent becomes even more extreme when we look at other industries like engineering, for example. And so that's one of the challenges.
Availability, that's such an interesting one, because I've heard that come up in a sort of conversation as well. And, you know, sometimes people talk about why is the expectation of people being always available, you know, something that's so built into the way we work. So I think that's definitely something that is quite systemic that we need to be looking at addressing as well. And John, what's your take on that?
I definitely agree with Oprah. I just added just one additional point. I think one of the things is that there's a lot of pressure to bring people into the organization. You got to get people hired, you want to fill a role, you want to go. It may be that we need to take a longer period of time to make sure we have a diverse pipeline, to make sure that, you know, the first, you know, male or whatever candidates we come in, we need to make sure it's balanced and really reflective of the marketplace, so we actually can see and make the decisions really based on a broader portfolio. And certainly, sometimes the expediency of closing can be in detriment of actually trying to achieve a more balanced portfolio of people that we need to bring in. It's something that we're absolutely working on at Google, and I think we're doing a better job at challenging ourselves before we go into the actual interview processes. Do we actually have a portfolio of people in that loop now that actually represents the marketplace, which is important as well.
And I think, you know, that to that point about, I think that sort of a challenge and that being a barrier, availability, and sometimes women sort of, you know, being the primary care as well. We got Felicity, I think a really interesting question from Felicity, talking about what sort of programs or sort of training investments have you seen that really embrace female professional returning to the workforce or making a career transition? You know, she actually said here in particular for women like Oprah's wife, precisely, where we're probably not talking about a short 1 to 2 year or less than 5, maybe like beyond that. How do we support that and how do we enable that?
I can add a couple of comments on what I've seen. And firstly, as we spoke on earlier, that firstly D&I needs to be part of the narrative of what we're doing as a leadership team. We need to understand that there is challenges in this front, and then understanding that, we then need to say, okay, how do we put in place programs and support networks and opportunities for individuals to work together. And we have some things, one of them we call Women at Function, where we actually have opportunities for females to come together, support each other. I'm actually an ally in that program. And then we have a thing called the Coffee Club, where more junior females can come together but be coached on their careers. And importantly, these moments in time that really matter, what's the best way of actually setting up for them, getting support, and learning from others who have already been down that path. And I think it's just really important for us to recognize it, put plans in place, and then have individuals find the support and the allyship they need across the organizations as well.
My colleague, the CIO of ANZ, Jared Florian, kicked off a program last year which was specifically focused on women returning to the workforce, and so have made places for women, have programs supporting them both before and on their return. And so that's one place where he sort of led the charge internally, which is fantastic. And it's a really lovely way to kind of signal that we understand some of the challenges. One of the other things that I have a colleague who's built a phenomenal development program specifically for our design community at ANZ. We've got 170 designers, And we looked at a range of skills that designers really need to build in order to kind of become future-proof, regardless of whether they stay with us or move on. And one of the skills was leadership. And so we had one of our team members pull together a little curriculum for leadership. And a big aspect of that is women in leadership. So we made a call that the primary focus wasn't on generic leadership. It was actually very much focused on supporting women in leadership. And we sourced a program from San Francisco specifically to look at that. So again, it was exciting to sort of see that we went a little bit more granular and said, where can we have the most impact, and where can we really move the dial for our folks? And it was actually in a very specific pointed part of leadership.
And I think I'll share a finding that we've had recently as well. So we actually started a program called She Pivots, and the intent was during this COVID period to actually connect professional women whose jobs have been COVID impacted, connect like a free program to upskill and reskill them, and then connect them with companies that are still hiring at the moment and are in fact many of them actively looking for diverse talent. And what was really interesting for us was that we actually uncovered a large segment of those were coming through really senior women who's actually been out of the workforce for a while, and they realized that right now the environment is not really helping in terms of getting them back into the workforce. So I think, if you know anyone in that sort of transitioning phase, I'll encourage you to have a look at a free program online, She Pivots, as well. And that really helps you to take stock of personal inventory, because I think sometimes it's even just about reflecting on the transferable skills that's still very practical and in demand in today's world. And on that as well, I think, we've talked about both the sort of systemic change and activities that company can run, but also grassroots level from an individual perspective. So we've got an audience here asking, how have you enabled successful change in gender equality at a grassroots level? I think particularly, how have you involved and engaged men in this conversation? I think that would be really interesting. And the audience is finding that it's usually the diversity dimension that people are most resistant to. John, do you want to start?
Yeah, look, I'll jump in here. And it only comes to life if the grassroots believe in it. It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters, but to a lesser extent, and what Oprah believes. It really is about, do the teams believe, and do they have passion for it, and will it actually make a difference? Part of the work that we do, I have across the broader organization, we call them like activity councils, or groups of people that come together from a number of different teams, but they work as a committee and they work on core things just like this. We have one that works on inclusion around gender, that works around Indigenous inclusion and other things, which is really awesome. But the drive and the energy is actually from the grassroots team. It includes females, it includes males. They're actually passionate for that. And so then they're working with their peers. They bring the challenges to life, and it actually makes it real. And that's the magic, is when you make it real for the broader organization through initiatives that come together in this way. So yeah, really excited by that. And I think that's when we can really make some really great systemic changes, when individuals across a broader organization really get a shared sense of the challenges and the opportunities of the things we're trying to achieve.
I think COVID has done some very interesting things. It's just humanized all of us. And so again, I sort of come back to, one of the things about ANZ is generally it feels like there's just already such a strong bias towards diversity and inclusion. We are already at 50-50, well and truly 50-50 when it comes to the executive team. We like all publicly traded organizations, obsess about measuring gender balance at all levels of the organization, and have made incredible strides in that direction. I would say, back to John's earlier point, we're not quite, I would say, 50-50 all the way across the entire structure of the organization. But so I don't feel like, I feel like we're actually at a point, I'm not quite answering the question, but I genuinely feel that there's enough of our focus on this across the culture that and there are so many activities always going on that I don't feel like there's a need to specifically invest in building the grassroots. It's happening already across the board. Could we be doing more? Without a doubt, I'm certain of that. But I feel like there are so many things that are happening that ANZ, I would say, has already done quite a phenomenal job of just signaling to the marketplace. This goes back 20, 25 years, even, for example, across the early days of supporting the Mardi Gras, that ANZ was taking a stand. And I think they've always been at the forefront there. So again, I'm not sort of claiming there's not more to do, but really, I don't know if the challenge we faced is really one of building grassroots, right? I think we're actually at a point where we're realizing that we actually need to support the community outside and help to tackle some of the systemic issues that can enable things like the pipeline into our organization, like some of the social norms, etc., right? That we may have as much impact by looking outside as we do by looking inside.
And I think ultimately systemic changes and choices and policies are shaped by people, you know. So if each individual can take on the ownership and I think in championing and taking ownership of this is not siloed, you know, in a D&I working group and like a HR function, I think that would really sort of enable the empowerment of everyone to be part of this. But I think it's really interesting that in one of the polls that we conducted with all the audiences here, that majority of the respondents today said it would take their company at a minimum 3 years to achieve 50-50. I mean, what would your answer be to that? Like, I mean, do you feel we can accelerate that? Why do you think that's something that we are, I suppose, very accustomed to in terms of it will take years and years to achieve?
Go ahead, John.
Look, I think in my mind, I was just going to say it depends. It depends on the senior leadership. It depends on the where the organisation is at today. It depends on a number of things. But as I was mentioning about ANZ, Google as well, we're obviously on that drive. 50-50 is absolutely the goal. Certainly my team's there and many teams are absolutely getting there. But I think it just really depends upon that organisation's leadership structure and what they want to do. Because if you say today it's going to be 50-50 tomorrow, there's actually a bunch of work you need to do in preparing leaders for tomorrow. And it's just like you can't wake up one day and say you'll be there. And for myself, we've been working for the last 5+ years on leadership development programs, preparing talent. How do you be a leader? What does it look like? How do you create followership? You don't just wake up one day and you're there. So part of it absolutely is a journey, but you don't get there unless you start and people are committed to it. Look, could 3 years be the right number? Maybe, depending upon the organisation and where they're at. It could be 2 years, it could be 1 year, but it really depends upon where the organisation's at, what the leadership capabilities are, what the DEI practices are across the broader organisation, and what they're prepared to do to operationalise that across the business as well. What investments they're prepared to make in development and acquisition of talent and all of those things as well. That would be my view. Absolutely possible, but just depends upon the senior leadership.
Yeah, I totally echo what John's saying. It's back to what we said before, that it's almost a flawed question to just say the 50-50 at the leadership team. Because if so, then you could focus very much on affirmative action, right? You could do it tomorrow. You could do it today if you really wanted to, right? And the question is, would you create the best team for your organization that would gel as a team, right? So even if you're going to focus exclusively on recruiting women, you still want to take your time and make sure that you are finding somebody who's going to work incredibly well, has the right fit for the overall team, for the sustainability of your organization, right? So I think that I've reflected on this in a number of different contexts. I come from South Africa, and I was elated at the end of apartheid. And so there was this massive move towards just thinking about affirmative action at all costs, right? Let's make sure that we've got racial balance, or even more so, let's completely swing the pendulum to reflect the percentage of the population, right, in South Africa. It was very difficult for the country, for South Africa to go through the process of being impatient about changing the balance, but finding that it wasn't just about the percentage. They actually had a whole country, not even one organization, that whole country that was systemically broken, right? Education, social norms, socioeconomic levels, etc. And so if you take an organization as a microcosm of that, you can operate at pace, but you don't want to do it at the expense of the longevity of your organization. I think if you signal that you're heading in the right direction and you make some bold moves and some big leaps, but signal that you still want to focus on making sure that systemically you move in the right direction, I think you can buy yourself a little bit of time. I think momentum and direction is important, not necessarily nailing the 50% and then finding that you've got a dysfunctional leadership team because you short-circuited what we all know is really important, which is any hiring decision or any promotion decision.
Yeah. And I love that you talked about momentum and direction. I think really at the core and the heart of it, that's actually what it is. You know, we've got a audience here as well, you know, saying that they agree with Ofer, that it's not really about a 50-50 split, you know, so wondering why 50-50 is being suggested here. But I think that's precisely what we are probably challenging today. You know, I've heard, you know, there's like 40-20. So, you know, 40 male, 40 female, and then 20 can go either way, can be anywhere in between. You know, there's 50-50. And I think I love your notion of 50-60, so that we are constantly thinking and stretching, you know, our goal of what that pie looks like and extending it. So it's not a zero.
Sarah, if we're brainstorming different ways of telling the story, you might also consider 0-0, which means a zero difference to the broader population, right? So whatever the broader population is, that your organization mimics the distribution of the broader population.
You're a true design thinker. I love it. 0-0 difference. Because
just trying to change the question.
I love it. Yeah, John's giving a double thumbs up. I've got a really interesting question here, actually, from Charlotte. Okay, so if it's so important, why aren't budgets being unlocked to help deliver? Same businesses are investing a lot in digital transformation, but not in people transformation. And this jumped out at me because I think that's absolutely true. We've seen the level of investment in sort of digital and technology transformation in the billions, whereas people transformation, that's very often not the case. What's your view on that?
Yeah, let me jump on this one quickly, a couple of quick comments. And my response is, firstly, it should be. And I can talk from a Google perspective. People transformation is one of the most important things we do. I actually sit on the People Steering Committee for Asia Pacific and for Global as well. And so the activities that we're continually doing and challenging ourselves with is what we used to do is not good enough for how we want to transform our people into the future. And I would say and actually I just recently worked with a colleague out of EMEA on a new global leadership development program called a Flagship Academy that we're actually launching inside of Google to actually take our junior leaders and make them senior leaders. And it's something that's such a priority that businesses will not be able to compete and be successful in the future unless they're investing in their people and do that piece, which is the people transformation and getting them ready for what's coming next. And so, look, I think if businesses aren't doing it, it's going to be tough for them to continue to succeed and be successful in the future, because the number one asset that all businesses have is people. And so what we do to help them transform and grow and be motivated and inspired is as our number one job. And so I absolutely challenge everyone to challenge the status quo on how their businesses are thinking about it, and investing in people is a top priority.
Yeah, I was reflecting on, my immediate reaction was to say, actually, we are spending well on this topic, but actually, I don't know if we're labeling it that way. You're right, we're spending a lot of money on digital transformation. I've never really felt a sense of being knocked back in any requests around personal development. We have obviously a lot of investment that goes into constantly recruiting and promoting and what have you. But so my immediate reaction was to say, no, actually we're spending so much. But as I reflect now, I don't know whether we've actually labeled it as kind of necessarily people transformation. I don't know whether we've necessarily labeled it to say any change that we make will, one of the objectives or one of the criteria for that investment is that we move the diversity forward. So it was a really interesting kind of thought reflection for me to say, actually, maybe we need to label, because we all spend millions or billions every year, all of our organizations, on change. And in many cases, all that change can come with a people transformation component. You don't necessarily need, in most cases, a separate budget. I think sometimes the budgets fail when they are dedicated just to people because it's a systemic problem. So you're right, that's an interesting, I would say, whoever asked that question, I think you're right. We almost need to either relabel our investments or just make sure that there are some other return on investment criteria related to the money we're spending already. It was a good question.
Yeah. And I think you talk about the professional development and the personal development and talent as well. We've got an audience here also asking a question that I think is very relevant, because in one of the polls that we just conducted with the audience earlier on, we asked them what key barriers do they think is contributing to lack of female talent in leadership. And the lack of female talent pipeline was ranked the highest. So the audience is asking here, I find that the lack of female talent pipeline is sometimes being used as an excuse to not hire women, instead of investing into or enabling them to succeed in the job or role. You know, especially if the requirement for the role might be modeled based on a person who didn't actually face barriers to employment before. I think that's a really sophisticated question. So what do you think about that? We might start with Ofer.
It's a really good point. It's a really good point. I've had some decisions recently to make around promotion, where this question about, does somebody really need to exhibit all the experience before you give them a shot? And I've made some decisions about giving people an opportunity because they've exhibited the characteristics that suggest that they will succeed. And so you're right. I think it in some cases it can be an excuse. I'll actually look at my wife, for example. My wife oftentimes is concerned about how she'll be perceived because of lack of experience. And I keep saying to her, there are so many characteristics you have that I just do not see in a lot of other people that I work with. You are head and shoulders above them in so many respects, right? And so I think that for me is proof that some cases we do put too much weight. And I have to say, I've also as a designer, put a lot of emphasis around a portfolio. Show me what you've done, right? Rather than saying, help me understand what you could do, right? Or let's give you an opportunity to actually grow into a role. So you're right. I think, I mean, it's a really tough one. It's when you're making hiring decisions, really, especially when you know that you're going to hire a leader who's going to have an influence on part of it's actually a very difficult thing to sometimes take a leap, right? So just to be it's a very difficult thing when you haven't seen evidence.
I can make a couple of quick comments. I had an opportunity a few years ago when I was looking for a director in the business, And I had a team member who wasn't a female, incredibly talented, but wasn't there. But I spent 6 months scouring the marketplace and interviewed lots and lots of males. And I was chatting with someone. They said, why don't you have a risk and give this person a shot? And it absolutely changed the way I framed and what I was about to do and how I was going to invest in someone else's development. And that was the best decision I'd made. The person is incredible. Yes, they didn't have all the ticks in the boxes at that point in time, but 2.5 years on, it absolutely smashed everyone. But if you had compared that person and where they were at with other people, you wouldn't have given them the job. So I guess my coaching and recommendation is, take some risks. It's actually okay. Take some risks on individuals who have all the core attributes to be successful, but they may not have had them on a piece of paper as yet because they haven't had the time. But take a risk and it can absolutely pay off as well.
And I think, John, with that, you've actually answered Catherine's question here as well about really we should, in hiring, broadening the experience criteria to actually allow and just to enable us to see a larger pool of female candidates as well to be considered in that process. And so I think that probably links into the last question. We've had so many questions come through. I cannot believe, honestly, the chat is going nuts. Okay, so I think this is probably go into the hiring as well, which is quite important around how do we actually attract more female talent into the pipeline, particularly, in technology spaces, STEM areas. And I think we've touched on that as well. But I think when it comes to leadership position, but also I think even we've seen in the language of the job ad, how it's structured, in the hiring panel and in the decision-making process, are there sort of 1 or 2 key tips, John and Ofer, you can share with the audience before we wrap up today?
Super quick. It's not just about the only thing I'd say is if you wait to the interview process to do it, you're going to fail. And so you got to start quite a few steps back from that. Even before you need to hire anybody, are you building a talent pipeline of great, capable female talent across the market? And are you having those coffee catch-ups? Are you doing those things? So when jobs come up, you actually have a talent pipeline of people who you can actually work with. So I guess all the rest of the things you said, I completely agree with, but don't wait until a job comes up to be filled. Start that work now because you will have jobs to be filled, no question at all.
Yeah, for me, I think just signaling that you care. So for example, we make a lot of effort around design to show how much we care at ANZ about design outcomes, about supporting designers, and about design development. All right. And so that's actually helped us build a value proposition for designers. I think the same thing goes for women to be able to very transparently just say, to indicate that we already have women in many, many influential and very, very senior roles of our organization, I think just speaks volumes already to say, and also in technology, for example, right? That kind of basically says, you know what, this is a place where it's very important to us. So I think just literally, if for every role, every hiring decision that you make when a woman is in a position of leadership, I think celebrating that and making sure that it's known that is the norm within the organization, then it actually, you're right, you don't have to try to make the effort to sell when the person's already applied.
Yes. Fantastic. We are at time, but given that you guys are so effective in sort of answering the sort of questions, I'll see if we can potentially consolidate some of these questions and potentially see what's possible and maybe respond to them as well. So thank you everybody for tuning in today. And once again, if you haven't already, please make sure you head to the website to download the report because that is very much a conversation starter. We love to hear your thoughts and more ideas and potentially, 50-60 or 0-0, differences that those ideas, those innovations can come about and really bridging the gaps here. So I've got one sort of final questions sort of from the audience here, which I think will be a fun note to end on. How would you encourage your male employees to do more domestic chores, which eventually will enable female advancement? 30 seconds each.
Oh gosh. Well, I'm laughing because I think I'm probably quite I'm probably not a good role model here. I think it starts with just being a good role model, doing it yourself, and maybe especially in COVID when actually we're all on video and everybody has seen warts and all. Maybe what I could do is actually start having some video conferences where all the men are actually multitasking and ensuring that they're demonstrating that they're doing chores while they're trying to do the work as well.
I think that's awesome. My only comment, 30 seconds, would be just be a role model. And equality and all this stuff, it's not just about the office, it's about every element of our lives that we want to actually be representing what we believe and how we want people and how we want to treat other people, whether that's in the home or everywhere else. And so I just say be a role model 100% of the time.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in, and thank you, John and Ofer. We still managed to wrap up right on two. So thank you very much for being great champions. Head to download the report and look forward to staying in touch with all of you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ofer, for your time.
Thank you. Take care. Cheers. Well done.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.